I am very happy to welcome David Loy. David is a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy, a prolific writer, and a teacher in the Sanbo Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. His books include Money, Sex, War, Karma, A New Buddhist Path, and most recently, Eco-Dharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis, which I highly recommend. He is especially concerned about social and ecological issues. In addition to offering workshops and meditation retreats, he is one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center near Boulder, Colorado. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. And also thank you to everyone here for joining us. Maybe first things first, can everyone see and hear me okay? Is everything all right there? Great, great. I'd like to begin by referring to something that Noam Chomsky said last year in an interview. He said that we are now living in the most dangerous time ever in the history of humanity. And I said, whoa, well, that's a pretty heavy, serious statement. So as a history buff, I sort of tried to think of counterexamples, and frankly, I couldn't if one understands his statement in terms of the future implications of what we do now. Curiously, he doesn't even mention the COVID pandemic, and I think that's right. I mean, horrific as it has been for so many people, it doesn't really compare with what happened, say, in the 14th century in Europe and Central Asia, where, maybe a third of all the people died. He does, of course, refer to the climate crisis, and I think it's important, whenever this comes up, to emphasize that urgent and certainly as much of an emergency as it is, I think we also really need to keep in mind that climate issues are really just the tip of a much larger ecological issue. I keep having to emphasize this because otherwise we can think, if we can just shift quickly enough from fossil fuels to renewables, which we need to do, of course, but somehow a lot of people think if we could just do that, then we can keep going on as we have been in other regards. And I think the larger climate crisis really points to the fact, well, if you just think about it, the sixth great extinction event, the so many other issues, the degradation of so much agricultural land, desertification, exhaustion of freshwater aquifers, plastics, including microplastics in our bodies, so many toxins in the sea, in the air, in the earth, in our drinking water, in our bodies, et cetera, population. And that's even without going into, issues of social justice and the growing gap between rich and poor economically, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously, we could spend a lot of time on that, sort of unpacking why it is that I think Chomsky's statement is right on the button there. Putting it all together, it seems to me that we need to face the fact that we are a civilization that's lost its way. That kind of with this tragic irony, just as we have attained a truly global civilization, it seems to be self-destructing. And of course, the topic for this evening is, what does the Buddhist tradition, what do Buddhist teachings and practices have to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately to this situation? I'm reminded of a couple Zen stories. One of them, the student asked the master, what should we do when difficult times come? And the master, it's kind of hard to show this on Zoom, but the master kind of holds out his arms, all right? Welcome. Our path is not about avoiding difficult times. In fact, as we know, often those are the times when we also experience the greatest personal transformation, personal growth. Right? There's another yeah, Zen dialogue. I think this one was with the great Chinese master Yunmen or Unman, who was asked by one of his students, how did he say it? What is the fruit of a lifetime of practice? And Unman said, responding appropriately. That's what our path is about. Our Buddhist path is about learning to respond appropriately. In other words, it's not really an attempt to escape or transcend this world, but more to actually face it directly and not try to evade it in some way, as of course we can try to do in our practice. So, what does Buddhism have to offer? Well, you might think maybe nothing. The Buddha lived, what, some 2,400 years ago in a very different time and place, Iron Age India. And so, needless to say, he didn't know anything about the kind of situation, the kind of emergency that we face today. And indeed, all of the Asian Buddhist traditions are pre-modern. They long predate the kind of situation that we find ourselves in. Nonetheless, of course, I think many of us feel that there are really important sort of implications built into the teachings that can be extrapolated. Two that really stand out for me, one of them that is maybe the most fascinating is what I see as a truly amazing, I mean, precise and profound parallel between what Buddhism has always had to say about our individual predicament and our collective predicament today, in the sense that as I understand the basic teaching, it's the fundamental dukkha, the fundamental suffering, is very much rooted in the delusion of a separate self that feels separate from other people. That in a way you can say that's at the heart of our dukkha. And doesn't it seem like it's much the same now, that at the root of our ecological crisis is the fact that we as a species feel and act separate. We feel we're separate from the rest of the earth, that the rest of the earth is just there for us to use and pollute, and that there's no special meaning or value in our realizing our non-duality with it. And of course, what we're now experiencing could be considered the karma from that way of acting. So that to me is the most fascinating extrapolation or implication of Buddhist teachings. But what I'd like to focus on this evening is what I nonetheless think is the most important, which is to say the Bodhisattva Path. Or rather, as I like to say, the new Bodhisattva Path, because I think we need to understand it somewhat differently, as I'll get into. And especially when we look at it in ecological terms, as some people are now saying, we can understand that as the Ecosattva Path, right? There are three aspects, I guess aspects is the best word, three dimensions of the Bodhisattva Path that I would like to talk about today. The first one is, I think, has always been the case, and we're all pretty much familiar with it, which is that the Bodhisattva has a double practice, right? He or she continues their own personal transformation practice, working for their own enlightenment or spiritual development, however you want to say it. So maybe doing meditation, zazen, and the other things that maybe go along with that for many people. Of course, in some traditions it might be involved more chanting or visualizations or whatever. But in any case, that continues. But nonetheless, they know that that's in itself insufficient, that one also uses whatever equanimity, serenity, emptiness one realizes or develops in that practice and brings it into our engagement with other people and indeed with the rest of the world, with the realization that other people aren't really other in the sense of being separate from us, and that we are not separate from the rest of the world. And I think it's also important to realize that these aren't simply sort of two practices that kind of fit very nicely together. I think more importantly, the two practices need each other if they are going to be as fruitful as we need them to be. Maybe this is most obvious in the case of, say, social activists. And, I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion and so forth. Given the dire nature of the larger ecological challenge, it becomes very difficult, I think, to avoid burnout, to avoid serious frustration when you're often involved in actions that aren't successful, that there are many setbacks or they don't work out the way that you hope. And so how do you avoid burnout? And I think that's one of the reasons why, if one can ground oneself in a contemplative practice like Zazen, or some kind of other spiritual practice, how that can be so extremely valuable in enabling one to cope with the inevitable setbacks that occur when one's involved in that practice. But it works the other way around too, in the sense, well, how to say it? It works the other way around too, in the sense that I think those of us who are engaged in Buddhist practice need that kind of engagement in the world, even if for our own sake, right? To avoid, you could say, a kind of clinging to emptiness, or a kind of serenity, understanding the path as kind of developing a kind of serenity that tries to ignore what's going on. I mean, when we start our Buddhist practice, I think it's because, I mean, if you think about everything that's involved in Buddhist practice, you think about all the time, energy, physical pain, backs, legs, mind, money, and so forth. I mean, why do we do it? The truth is, most of us start that path because our life isn't working out as well as we would like to. And so inevitably at the very beginning, I think there's a certain kind of self-preoccupation, which is natural and fine, right? There's something missing, something isn't quite right. We're looking for some deep answers that we need. And yet, as we go along, I think one of the things that develops naturally if we continue with the practice, right, is the realization that very much at the heart of our problem is our self-preoccupation. Maybe the presumption that our own well-being is separate from the well-being of other people, or separate from the well-being of the world in general. And so I think there's a sense in which there's a kind of natural development there that occurs, that as we become less self-centered, less egotistical, as we become more aware of the suffering in the world, there's kind of a natural development in that direction. I'm reminded here of a quotation from Franz Kafka, who in a letter said, let me pull this up, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do. But perhaps your holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world, but perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering that you could avoid. Insofar as we realize our engagement, our interdependence, our non-duality with the world, compassionate engagement with it seems a necessary part of our own overcoming of our dukkha. Joanna Macy says that in the early Buddhist scriptures, there's a wonderful phrase describing the relation between wisdom and action. They are like two hands washing each other. It's a dance of reciprocity. And that reminds me of something Nisargadatta, in fact, maybe it's my all-time favorite quote. Forgive me if you've heard me say it before. Actually, he's not a Buddhist, right? He's a Neo-Vedantin teacher, but I think he expressed this so well when he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love." between these two, my life flows. That's perfect, right? Right? Um, wisdom and love, or as we usually describe the two pillars in Buddhism, wisdom and compassion. And he shows us the relationship between them, right? Insofar as we realize that there is no separate self. What is love? It's something that's going to flow naturally. It's not a feeling. It's a way of being. It's a way of living in the world with the realization that we are part of that world. And even in terms of our own sort of personal development, there's another aspect to this that I'm reminded of. I remember when I started very early in my Zen practice, I lived in the Maui Zendo, one of the centers created by Robert Aiken. Uh, and it was a pretty unconventional Zen center. I mean, but nonetheless, we had a pretty strict schedule. We did a lot of sitting every day and so forth. And what I remember is that because of that, it wasn't so difficult to sort of have moments of opening insight, sometimes might be described as kensho, realizations about um, about ourselves and about the world. But what was more interesting, I think, and this wasn't only my own experience, it's one thing to have those experiences of sort of self, realizing, seeing through self preoccupation and so forth. And it's one thing to have those experiences. What and I think others found more difficult was to actually integrate those into how we actually live in the world. That's actually a harder thing to do. And so I wonder if the one of the reasons I think that's important is I think many of us have some bit of a romanticized idea about the path. I'm thinking of somebody like Milarepa in the Tibetan tradition, who sort of went off into a cave by himself and lived on nettles that turned his skin green. And because he's practiced so hard, he supposedly went to Buddhahood in one lifetime and so forth. Somehow we have the idea of our path is very much, secluding ourselves, going inside ourselves. And I'm struck by the way Joanna Macy put it very bluntly. The world has a role to play in our awakening. I remember Ram Dass used to say, so you think you're enlightened, huh? Well, go spend the holiday with your family, with your relatives. That's a real test, how easy it is to fall back into our old ways of being, especially in relation to people who, see us, have expectations about us. He talked about the path as a self-sharpening sword where, we meditate, things happen, we go out in society, we can change how we relate to other people, but we also see where we're stuck. And so that encourages us in our practice to go more deeply, to see through that. In other words, engagement with the world's problems is not to be understood, as I think many of us have in the past. It's not a distraction from our personal spiritual practice, but it's a necessary part of it. In fact, maybe we can say that when bodhisattvas engage in the world, the ones who benefit the most from that engagement are the bodhisattvas themselves. As Kukai, or Kobo Daishi, one of the great founders of Japanese Buddhism, put it, the measure of our enlightenment is how we serve others. So that's the first point. I think these two hands washing each other, or the fact that I think built into the Buddhist path is this understanding of the Bodhisattva path as double-sided, where our personal transformation and the kind of social, and we can say political and ecological transformation that we work toward, that those, they're not things that interfere with each other. On the contrary, they are things that actually work together very nicely. And frankly, it seems to me that at this particular point in history, at this very dangerous point in in our species history, as Chomsky put it. I think that's something we really have to emphasize. Anyway, that's the first point that I want to say about the Bodhisattva path. The second point is that I think, given the kinds of challenges we face today, I think we now can have and do have a deeper understanding of dukkha, that is the kind of suffering that Buddhism deals with, right? Dukkha, as I'm pretty sure almost all of you know, right? That's the word usually translated into English as suffering. But that really only makes sense if we understand it in the broadest possible sense, right? Not just physical and mental pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, and maybe my favorite, dis-ease. I mean, the Buddha himself said very clearly all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. And of course, the Four Noble Truths are all about dukkha, the cause of dukkha, the end of dukkha, and how to end dukkha. So clearly, dukkha is very much at the part of it, at the heart of the path, understanding and putting an end to our dukkha. Buddhism, as we know, in Buddhism, the big issue isn't good versus evil. That's not how we understand the world. What the Buddha talked about, though, which we sometimes talk about as the three roots of evil, more literally the three fires or the three poisons. These are sort of identified as the things that create so many problems. If what we do is motivated by the three poisons, that is to say, greed, ill will, and delusion, if what we do is motivated by them, then it's going to tend to create problems for ourselves as well as for other people, and indeed for the world in general. Now, when we look at the Buddhist tradition, of course, the way that it's tended to understand that is very much on an individual level, right? In other words, it's my own karma. If something bad happens to me, well, it must be because of something I did earlier in this lifetime or maybe in a previous lifetime. I think it's important to realize that the Buddha himself seems to have been quite a bit more progressive than the institution that developed after he died. At least that's my feeling that I get when I study the Pali Canon, right? When you look at his attitude toward women, for example, the fact that he created a Bhikkhuni Sangha with the realization that women have the same potential to awaken as men. You know, given the situation of women in India at that time, that was a hugely progressive thing. And likewise, his attitude toward caste, right? The fact that when you joined the Sangha, you lost caste and you weren't even really supposed to talk about it. Well, that's pretty huge too. That's sort of similar to what today we might consider a very strong anti-racist position. A problem, I think, occurred after he died, where I think patriarchy reasserted itself pretty strongly. And likewise, the Buddhist institutions tended to sort of come to an accommodation with the state. You know, it's like, especially in the early days, this kind of Buddhist cult or whatever you want to call it, in order to survive and thrive, it had to be very careful about rulers. And it seems to me that that may well have played a big role in terms of how Buddhism traditionally has understood what the fundamental problem is. Again, reducing it to the individual level. Buddhism didn't call out rulers. It wanted their support. It would advise them when they came knocking, but it's not as though Buddhism really sort of challenged the authority or, you know, the kings or the emperors. And sometimes, of course, they would claim to be bodhisattvas or Buddhas, and even the whole karma teaching would tend to rationalize their position. If someone's born a prince and becomes a king, right, he must have really good karma from his past lifetime, and so we should kind of support him. I mean, I think I'm giving a very sort of sketchy overview here, but I think something like that was in play and maybe was necessary in order for Buddhism to do as well as it did and spread as well as it did, that the focus was on individual transformation. Nonetheless, in the modern world now, you know, I think what we can see is that it doesn't work, it's not right, simply to reduce the dukkha to my own dukkha to something I've done it as my own just rewards. I remember I once heard a Tibetan teacher sort of reflect out loud, and he said, "Oh, what terrible karma those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born in that time and place." Friends, that's not acceptable anymore, blaming the victim. I just refuse to accept that, and I think we all should. I think we understand so much more now about social historical forces and how people can be trapped within them. And I think part of that is this better understanding of the three poisons, greed, ill will, delusion, that they're not things that simply function on an individual level, but we can see how they become collective and indeed institutionalized in the sense that I think they have sort of taken on a life of their own. What am I referring to there? Well, if greed, for example, means you never have enough, if greed means you never have enough and you always want more, isn't that a pretty good description of our economic system? Not only, consumerism, which in many ways I think of as the real religion of the modern world, but also if you think about corporations, how the profits are never high enough. The stock prices, share prices are never high enough. Market share is never big enough, and so forth. I mean, as we know, there's this need built into the economic system to keep growing, and if it doesn't do that, it tends to collapse. And to me, that suggests something like institutionalized greed, or as I like to say, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? As far as institutionalized ill will, well, it seems to me we have a number of examples. Our attitude toward undocumented immigrants, racism, a very punitive legal penal system. We have 4% of the world's population and 25% of its incarcerated people and so forth. But I think maybe the best example is militarism. If we measure by the amount of resources we give to our military, the United States is by far the most militarized nation in world history. And the irony there, of course, is if you're going to spend all that much money on your military, well, you better use it once in a while, right? To justify that enormous amount of money. And also, of course, we know the way that the military is used to make sure we have access to the resources that we want. I mean, it seems to me a certain kind of militaristic way of thinking is an institutionalized form of ill will. An institutionalized delusion, wow, lots of things we can talk about there, right? Certainly in the era of Trump, we can think about fake news. But even before Trump, I mean, if you think about the media and how much, for example, most of the media in this country are corporate, and frankly, they're not so much interested in informing or educating us about what's going on as finding ways to grab our eyeballs and selling our attention to the highest bidder, that is to say, with advertising. And so, media itself sort of encourage consumerism and take for granted and encourage us to take for granted the kind of socioeconomic political system that we have today, right? So in those three ways, I think we can see that the classical understanding of greed, ill will, delusion, the way that it's been used in the Buddhist tradition, that I think we need nowadays, and we see the necessity to take that a step further if we're going to actually be able to address the kinds of extraordinary challenges that Chomsky has been referring to, right? It seems to me that one important development over my sort of Buddhist lifetime is that I think we American Buddhists have become a lot better in understanding sort of individual bodhisattva engagement, individual to individual, as a part of our path. That is to say, maybe helping homeless people, or prison dharma, such as I used to do when we lived in Cincinnati, or hospice work, understanding that, you know, this way of expressing compassion can be very, very important. But if I can use a metaphor here, I think in that regard, we have become a lot better in pulling drowning people out of the river, but we're not much better in asking why and how it is that there are so many more people drowning in the river. Who or what is pushing them in upstream? And that's where we really need to look at the systematization, the institutionalization of the kinds of problems that we face today. And I think that's not going to be an easy thing to do, you know, especially insofar as Buddhism emphasizes us to sort of let go of concepts, you know, when we're meditating and so forth. And nonetheless, though, I think these kinds of questions are becoming more and more important and ultimately inescapable. And it also connects with something else that I noticed, maybe more in the Zen world, but I'm not even so sure. You know, of the three treasures of Buddhism, it seems, you know, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. It seems to me we have lots of Buddha teachers. We have lots of Dhamma teachings, books, recordings, and so forth, and like this evening for that matter, where I think we're lacking, not in all cases, but I think certainly in many, is Sangha, the sense of community. I think it's important to remember that in the, you know, for the Buddha, the Sangha was fourfold. And not only the bhikkhu monks and the bhikkhuni nuns, but also the layman and the laywoman. They were all part of the Sangha. But what's happened over time is somehow the Sangha is associated with the bhikkhu, right? The monastic men, because most of the women ones have sort of faded away, the bhikkhuni sanghas. And therefore, there's very much the sense that lay practitioners are sort of second-class Buddhists. And I think especially in a place like the United States, where Buddhist practice is not primarily monastic, I think we really need to ask deep questions about community, right? I mean, I'm just struck in Zen how easy it is. You know, we can go to a Zen center, you know, we can meditate facing the wall, we can listen to a Dharma talk by the teacher, maybe have a one-on-one, and maybe the only time that we're communicating with somebody else is maybe tea at the end, or maybe not even then. And how I think the kind of situation we find ourselves in now is more and more urgently requiring us to ask deeper and to form deeper, stronger sanghas, right? I mean, even on a pure survival level, I think if things unfold as they might, the most important thing might be not whether we have some bags of brown rice and lentils in our basement, but whether we are part of a community, a loving community where people are there for each other and look out for each other. I'm reminded of something Bill McKibben said when he was in Paris for the climate talks a few years ago. Somebody came up to him and asked him and said, "What can I do as an individual?" And he said, "Stop being an individual." I don't know if we need to stop being an individual completely, but we need to be, if we're going to work on these collective institutional problems, we need to come together in ways that often our traditional understanding of Buddhist practice hasn't encouraged enough. Yeah. And of course, the Buddha himself, we know how he emphasized the importance of spiritual friends. Although, you know, you could say this goes beyond that, but you remember Ananda, you know, said to him, you know, I think spiritual friendship, right, is like half the path. And the Buddha said, don't say it like that, Ananda. Spiritual friendship is the whole of the path. There's so much that we can learn from each other. And I think so much that we need to be learning and so much help we need to be getting from each other in these difficult times. Anyway, that's the second of the three aspects. And that's why I talk about the new Bodhisattva path, because I think we have an expanded understanding of the challenge and the dukkha. The third and final point that I want to talk about is that the Bodhisattva Path, and this is traditional, I think, it doesn't so much tell us what to do. And indeed, as I said earlier, I don't think we can expect that. We can't go back to the sutras and shastras and read off how we respond to increasing amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? It doesn't tell us what to do, but it has a great deal to tell us about how to do what we do, right? And I think that's so important these days, where, well, really, I think a number of responses are needed here. I mean, if I just think about the local eco-dharma community here in the Boulder area where I live, I mean, one of my friends, who's also a Zen teacher, is a retired banker. And so his engagement is he goes to Congress. He's good at talking to Republicans and conservatives about climate change and the need for a carbon tax. That's his way of engagement. Another one of my local friends is very good on helping us individually reduce our carbon footprint. So when my wife and I bought this new house, we were able to get an energy audit and solar panels and so forth. Another example is, and this is something that I think is important and may become more important in the future, is civil disobedience, or nonviolent direct action, such as Extinction Rebellion has been doing for some time now. Anyway, we could talk about that, but the big question is, okay, which of those is a Buddhist response? And I would say, well, all of them. And no doubt many others as well, that we need to be creative in terms of what we do. And I don't think it's a matter of Buddhists forming, a completely new movement, but it's more that we Buddhists have a lot to contribute to other movements that are already out there. We don't need to be distinctive. We don't need to be pushing a Buddhist political party or something like that. But I think we do have our own particular perspective, and in particular, the Bodhisattva Path is a really important part of that contribution, right? So anyway, looking at classical Buddhism, there's lots of things it says about the Bodhisattva Path. As many of us know, instead of the early classical Eightfold Path, Bodhisattvas are encouraged to develop what are called 6 paramitas, or 6 perfections, to develop 6 character traits to the highest possible degree. And they usually are what? Generosity, ethical behavior, endurance, persistence, meditation or some form of mindfulness, and finally wisdom. Non-dual wisdom, prajna, that these are characteristics that we develop. These are how, and I guess you could say, as we engage with really difficult situations, and we have plenty of those around, these traits are what are going to be especially beneficial, but they will also be the traits that develop as we engage with those. It's like we ourselves will change and grow in those directions, right? I mean, there's lots of other things we can say, right? Obviously, Buddhism, from a Buddhist perspective, because we don't talk about good versus evil, it's not going to be emphasizing sort of the distinction between us good guys and the bad guys there, and that somehow the idea is to defeat or destroy them. I mean, what we're really talking about, even if we sometimes do have to stop what people are doing, nonetheless, it's clear from a Buddhist perspective that the origin, the root of our activism is not anger, it's not fear, but ultimately it's love and compassion that is motivating us, right? There's another aspect of the Buddhist tradition that I especially appreciate here too, and it's it follows from what to me is one of my all-time favorite stories in the Pali Canon, where the Buddha compares his teachings to a raft, if you remember that, right? So the Dharma, his teachings, they're a raft to help us get across the river of life and death to the other shore, right? They're to help us achieve something. And then he says, once you get there, the idea isn't, oh, what a wonderful raft this has been. I think I'm going to carry it around on my back everywhere that I go. He says, no, you don't need to do that. And I just think that's the most fantastic story, right? The Buddhist teachings, they're heuristic. That's right. They're not sacred. We don't put them like a Bible in an altar and worship them. They're not the word of God. They are a guidebook. They are a map to help us go somewhere and do something. And therefore, there's a lot of emphasis in the Buddhist tradition on skillful means of using them and helping us get where we need to go, right? So I think built into that is very much a pragmatism and a kind of non-dogmatism that we need to embody as we try to address the kinds of problems we face. But none of that so far gets at what to me is the most distinctive and powerful aspect about Bodhisattva activism. And for me, what stands out most of all, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time, such as it is, talking about that. For me, what stands out most of all is that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. Let me say that again. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results, to the consequences. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha himself says that one characteristic of an awakened person is that their actions are nirasa, which is translated in different ways, without expectation, sometimes even without hope. And you find this in later Buddhist teachings as well. So in the Tibetan Lojong teaching, one of the aphorisms offers a kind of classic formulation of this, where it says, abandon any hope or expectation of fruition. Don't get caught up in how you're going to be in the future. Stay in the present moment. And interestingly, this isn't only a Buddhist teaching, right? If we look, for example, at Hinduism, in particular, the Bhagavad-Gita, the single most important sort of Hindu text for most Hindu people, it talks about different paths to God. And one of them is karma yoga, the path of action, the path of engagement. And it says very clearly, an essential aspect of karma yoga is that your right is to the work, never to the fruits. So this is a really important teaching, right? Non-attachment to results. And yet, I think you can feel with me that there's a danger here talking about that too, especially when we think about in Buddhism, there's so much emphasis on motivation and intention. We might think that the only thing that's important is my motivation, and it doesn't matter whether anything actually happens. And I think that would be a terrible misunderstanding, a complete misunderstanding of what this non-attachment to results is really pointing at. So let me talk a little bit. Let me try to unpack that a little bit in three ways. Always the law of threes, right? To begin with, think for the moment on the difference between running a 100-meter dash and running a marathon. When you're running a 100-meter dash, the whole idea is to get to the other end as quickly as possible, and you don't really have time to think about anything else or need to, right? But obviously you can't run a marathon that way, or what happens? You burn yourself out really quickly. Instead, if you're running a marathon, what do? You pace yourself. And in fact, it helps if you're not thinking so much about the goal. I mean, you're running in the right direction, but you're not thinking about the goal. What are you doing? You are just right here, right now, just this step, what the Japanese call tada, just this. You return to the present moment. And in fact, I've heard marathon runners, and I'm not one of them, but they say, this runner's high of that you can get when you are doing that, right? Without being preoccupied with the finish line. And of course, you're moving in that direction. You're not sitting by the side of the road. You're moving in that direction, but you don't need that kind of fixation. In Buddhism, in early Buddhism too, right? Tathata, just thisness, or the Tathagata, another term for the Buddha, one who just comes and just goes, right? You're doing You're approaching the goal because you're doing what's necessary right now. And of course, that's what our practice has always encouraged, right? When our minds wander, we return to the now, right? So I think there's an important truth built into that. But there's a lot more to say too, in the sense that a marathon, even a marathon comes to an end, right? If you go long enough, what is it, 26 miles and something? Sooner or later, you will get to the end if you continue on that direction. But what about a path with no end? With a task so difficult that we might otherwise tend to become discouraged. Such as, for example, as Zen students recite, right, the first of the Four Noble Vows. Living beings are numberless. I vow to save them all, or liberate them all, or whatever term that you might want to use, right? If we really understand what this vow, what this commitment means, how can we avoid feeling overwhelmed? We are promising to do something that literally cannot be accomplished. And of course, that's the point. The focus is not on the goal as it is the direction, right? That the vow cannot be fulfilled is not the problem, but the point. What the vow is really calling on is a reorientation of the meaning of our lives, away from the usual what's in it for me to primary concern for the well-being of everyone. And as we know now, the earth as well, right? So on a day-to-day level, what becomes important is not the unattainable goal, but the direction of our efforts, a direction that orients us without providing any particular endpoint. And I think this is important in terms of the eco-crisis, because someone who has taken this kind of a vow that we know will never come to an end, a vow that involves embodying a whole different way of being in the world, such a person then will not need to become discouraged if, or feel frustrated when one's actions, one's engagement, one's activism is sometimes frustrated, right? You're not going to be intimidated by challenges that sometimes feel hopeless, right? So it's this new way of being in the world. No matter what happens, well, maybe we do feel discouraged, but one nice thing about our practice is we have a way to deal with that, right? Maybe things don't work out as we would like, but hey, then we meditate and we're able to let it go and then come back again. When we're successful, it's time to move on to the next thing. When we're not, well, we keep trying, or maybe we try in a different way indefinitely. And it's not so much that this is a burden. It's really kind of the opposite. Once we realize our non-duality with other people in the world, our embeddedness in this our intimacy with this magnificent planet that takes care of us all, this is the way that we want to live. We don't want to do anything else. It becomes our passion and our joy. Nonetheless, there's a third and a final point that stands out for me, and this is what I'll end with. If we're honest, looking at the ecological crisis, let's be frank, it does not look good. There's the very real possibility that our efforts will be in vain. I mean, in my research, I hear from or by climate scientists, and, some of them think that we're already past tipping points or maybe very close to them. And privately, they're not very optimistic about what's going to happen. Even though it's difficult to anticipate what will happen, it doesn't look good, right? And you hear people saying not only that it's going to be very difficult for human species, but that the temperatures involved might involve, who knows, maybe even human beings. Homo sapiens can't really survive with the kind of changes that could happen. The big point here is that we just don't know. We just don't know. It doesn't look good. It's not a matter of looking good, looking bad. Ultimately, it's just that we just don't know. We just don't know. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Just don't know. Isn't that something that our practice encourages? Certainly in Zen, we talk a lot about don't know mind. There's a famous koan, right? Not knowing is most intimate. I'm thinking also of the Zen peacemakers for whom not knowing is the first of their tenets, right? The other two, what is it? Bearing witness to the joy and suffering of the world, and thirdly, taking actions that arise from that not knowing and bearing witness. But how do we understand not knowing here? Roshi Eigyoku Nakao describes it. I quite like the way she puts it, quote, a flash of openness or a sudden shift to being present in the moment, in which we take shelter in. I guess I'd prefer to say open up to, but anyway, we take shelter in the place before anything arises, a place of emptiness and profound silence. With don't know mind, we become more spacious, right? More aware of our own reactivity and less determined by it, more open to the perspective of others. It's not so much a fixed position as it is a way of engaging with the world just as it is and just as we are. So, maybe we don't know what's going to happen next, but we do the best we can according to how we understand the situation, and we're ready to change if the situation changes or if our understanding of the situation changes, right? I'm reminded here of a short poem by Wendell Berry, The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. I remember Aitken Roshi, Robert Aitken, he used to like to say, our path, our task isn't about clearing up the mystery, but making the mystery clear, right? Our path isn't about sort of coming, oh, now we understand everything, but opening up to a profoundly mysterious world where everything is changing, whether or not we notice, right? And as bodhisattvas, we access this mystery not by grasping it in order to rest in it, but it's really the opposite. We're taken by it, and thereby we end up manifesting something more than our own egos, right? And for those of us on the path, this awesome mystery, it's not debilitating. There's something empowering about it. It liberates us from our egos. It liberates us from dogmatism and other fixed ideas about ourselves and the world. We do the best we can in response to the best we know, even if we don't know for sure what's happening or what's possible. And as soon as I think about that, I remember the end of the Cold War. Many of you are old enough to remember that as well, and how quickly that happened. And it's like, I don't even think the CIA saw it coming, it seemed like, and then also South Africa, right? It seemed like one day Nelson Mandela was in prison on an island, the next day he was free, and the next day he was president of South Africa. I mean, it wasn't quite that quick, but you get the idea that somehow, whoa, who saw that coming? It's like, the point being, things can change really, really quickly. And the point of not knowing mind is avoiding the kind of dogmatism where the world is the way it is and it's always going to be the way it is. Howard Zinn put this very well when he said, there's a tendency to think that what we see in the present moment will continue. Well, we forget how often we've been astonished by the sudden crumbling of institution, by extraordinary changes in people's thoughts, by unexpected eruptions of rebellion against tyrannies and quick collapse of systems of power that seemed invincible. I think we need to remember that when we feel discouraged about the ecological crisis, because it seems so overwhelming and the odds are so difficult. And I really appreciate what he says there. I wonder too sometimes if we're approaching a similar cusp in relation to the ecological crisis, right? Now, to say that is not to talk about being optimistic or hopeful, because as far as I'm concerned, both optimism, pessimism, hope, despair, both of those are dualistic ways of thinking that are actually problematic. That it's important for us to distinguish despair, for example, from the grief that we sometimes feel and sometimes need to feel about what is happening now. But both of those dualities, optimism, pessimism, hope, despair, they're kind of a future orientation that can be very problematical. I remember anyway, my favorite definition of a pessimist, somebody who has had to live with an optimist, right? That kind of brings in how they can feed off each other and how, our hope and despair can feed off each other. How we can, I think the Bodhisattva path, bodhisattvas are motivated by something deeper than, hope or optimism. There's a compassionate generosity of spirit that wants to express itself. And of course, it seeks results, but it doesn't require them. I'm reminded here too of something Joanna Macy said when she wrote, "I find that assuring people there's hope, including myself, is not all that useful. In Buddhism, there is no word for hope. It would be viewed as a distraction from what's at hand. It takes you out of the present moment and into conjecture. I think all we can really affirm is where we want to put our attention. I have a choice. Do I want to give up and surrender to the great unraveling? Or do I want to join those who are working for a livable future? Since the outcome is uncertain, again, don't know mine, we have to enjoy doing something exhilarating and useful without knowing for sure if it's going to work out." Actually, that's how Václav Havel, the Czech dissenter and politician, said, right? He redefined hope. Hope isn't the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing, regardless of how it turns out. And Wendell Berry, too, makes this point. We don't have the right to ask, he says, whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? And so this, to me, it brings us back to that essential point. What does it mean to act without attachment to results? I think these people are pointing at the single most important aspect of non-attachment, of don't know mind in this time of world crisis. And I would put it like this. Our task today is to do the very best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be. Not knowing if our efforts will make any difference whatsoever. And because for me, that's the most important thing I can say this evening, I'm going to repeat it. Our job, our task, our role is to do the very best we can, not knowing what the results will be, not knowing if our efforts will make any difference at all. Have we already passed ecological tipping points and civilization as we know it is doomed? Well, we don't know, but that not knowing is okay. Of course, there's hope in the sense that, we would like it if our efforts bear fruit. We try to be strategic, yet ultimately, and this is a really important way to express it too, what we do, whatever we do ecologically, it's our gift to the earth as well as to each other. It's our gift to the earth gratis. And, you don't give a gift with the expectation of something in return. That's not really a gift. So you give a gift, you don't know what's going to happen to that gift. And that's okay. We don't know if what we do, if anything we do is important, but it's important for us that we do it. Somebody in the notes in the chat quoted the Talmud. Yes, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. That's another aspect from another spiritual tradition. I think it's really important to bring that in, to realize that we're not talking about things that are only, a monopoly of Buddhist Dharma, but that these are spiritual truths that are going to be found in many different traditions. To act without attachment to results, I don't mean to minimize how difficult that is. Maybe impossible unless we also have some kind of spiritual foundation. And that brings us back to this point about the double path of the Bodhisattva. Probably acting without attachment to results is impossible unless we have that fundamental grounding in a practice where we are not attached to whatever arises in the mind, not just results, but anything else, right? And of course, this is setting the bar very high, but the whole point is because we have the practice, even when we are frustrated, we have a way to deal with that, right? Our job isn't to be perfect, it's to do the best we can. And that's why these two sides work so well together, right? We do the best we can. We're frustrated. We really hope this was going to happen. It didn't happen. We return to our practice. We bring that into the practice, and we're able to feel empowered again, right? In any case, I wonder if the earth today is calling upon all of us to act in this fashion. Anyway, to conclude, it seems to me, frankly, that if we contemporary Buddhists, if we don't want to do this or we can't do this kind of way that I've been talking, then maybe Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. But of course, what I've tried to do in this talk is to show, I think, how much Buddhist teachings can actually help us understand and respond to the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. So, apologies, I've gone on a bit, but I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and absolutely no apologies needed. That hour, from my perspective, flew by, and thank you very much for your teachings. We'd like to take some questions. I'm not sure, David, how much time you have. Let us know. Yeah, when you need to.
I'm available, so yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we can either I see somebody already has a virtual hand up. I can and a couple of people do. So I can let people unmute themselves and ask their own questions, or we can have people put things in the chat and I can moderate. So I guess if it's okay, I'll just let people unmute themselves and okay, so we'll do that. And just so everyone is aware, we are recording this. If for some reason you do not want to, be recorded, you can put your question in the chat and I'll ask that. Okay, so I actually saw Karsten's hand go up first and then Dorothea. So Karsten, go ahead.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
First, David, it's really nice to see you again. We saw each other in Asilomar many years ago at a conference, a CP conference. What I actually have several thoughts about what you said. The first is that there's a fine cut between caring about what happens and not getting attached. So I really care that our species and many other species survive. And the prognosis looks grim and in a very specific way. If corporate capitalism continues, I don't see any way we're going to solve the problem. And we have a window of 10 years, maybe 15 years. Some people don't even think we have that window. And to imagine dismantling global corporate capitalism in that time just seems overwhelming, but I do care about the survival of our species and other species. And so how to have that care and not be somewhat attached to the idea that it's not just that we're going to do something and, you know, maybe it's not going to work out now, but maybe it'll work out 20 years later. If it doesn't work out now in the next 10, 15 years, it's not going to work. So a second thing is just in relation to capitalism. I wonder if you can say something. You've said a lot about capitalism in your books, I know. If you can say something about what a Buddhist contribution might be to thinking about how to dismantle capitalism.
in 1 minute or less, right? Sorry.
In 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, wow. Well, two really challenging and important questions, comments. Regarding the first, I think you're pointing to the essential, I don't know what to call it, paradox, contradiction. You know how in Buddhism, especially in Mahayana, we talk a lot about the two truths, right? And on the one hand, and the real ultimate challenge, I think, is integrating the two truths, or seeing that they're two aspects of the same thing, as it were. And so on the one hand, the realization through our practice of that place, and I always feel very awkward when I try to talk about it because it can so easily be misunderstood, but the realization of that place where there's no better and no worse, no loss and no gain, no one to save and no one to be saved and no one to do the same. It's like that place of emptiness, if you were, and that's a dimension, and that's a dimension we can clinging to emptiness and totally misunderstand. And then the other side is the other one dimension, that this magnificent world of so many species, of so many people, of so many wonderful things, which is itself a manifestation. It's that emptiness taking form, wonderful forms all the time. And I think what you basically pointed to is the central challenge for a bodhisattva, is that kind of knife edge, if you will, of somehow being able to appreciate and feel both of those. I don't know how much more about it I could say, but one thing I would emphasize is I think one of the really important things there is getting in touch with our grief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe that seems off the point, but I think that's actually essential, that so many of us are grieving or afraid to grieve. We're repressing our grief. We're so afraid things are so bad. We're afraid the grief is going to blow us away. And in fact, feeling the grief, which we can help each other do, is somehow necessary to being able to be. And the grief doesn't release us from the caring, but it kind of empowers us in a way that we can care without being destroyed by what's happening in the phenomenal world. I guess it would be interesting to have a whole long session on the question that you raised. And to some degree, I tried to talk about it in chapter 5 of the book, but maybe I'll leave it at that at the moment. Regarding capitalism, very briefly, I think one important issue to remember is capitalism is not one thing. What we have in America, and also largely Britain, Anglo-American capitalism, is an especially virulent form where capitalism rules the roost, right? Capitalists, and Marx got this right, the people who own and control the economic system control the political system. Well, but there are other types, and I think without being able to go into it more, I wonder if certain types of social democracy, it's like capitalism, there's a certain kind of energy there, and I don't know that we can ever completely avoid the market, or we'd want to. It's so efficient, it's so wonderful in certain ways. At the same way, can one use that vitality and the creativity that is built into that. And that's where you need really strong, clear government regulation to limit it. And, to make sure that we don't have a system that basically is more concerned about producing billionaires than, eliminating the incredible poverty and difficult lives of the bottom 50% of the American or the world's people. So I don't know. It seems to me, if you understand capitalism as, in a way, building on the market, I think we need some kind of market. The question is, how might that be constrained in a way that works for the good of everyone and indeed for the earth? And the other issue, of course, is that we're running up against the limits of growth, right? One way to understand the ecological crisis is that, as Naomi Klein put it, we have two different systems. One of them has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse, our economic system, and the other one is the biosphere, which doesn't grow. And sooner or later, let's say now, those systems are going to clash with each other. And as she also says, only one of those systems can be changed. So if we have a version of capitalism, it's going to be a version that doesn't depend on endless economic growth in the sense of extracting more Earth's resources and such. Those are just a few reflections to two very fascinating, important questions.
Is there anything that we as Buddhists, though, can specifically add? There's the Marxist analysis, and there are all kinds of ideas of how to dismantle capitalism or tame it and so forth. Is there something that we can add to that discussion as Buddhists?
Well, I think the big thing that Buddhism adds, capitalism is largely competitive and emphasizes individualism, especially the kind of consumer capitalism that we have. And so at some point, there has to be emphasis on interdependence, right? There has to be the realization and emphasis that my well-being ultimately isn't separate from your well-being. And I find it fascinating that this is something, just in the last generation, we've had this great realization, not only psychologists, but economists and sociologists, that once you get to a certain level of income, what really is a determinant of happiness is not how much more money you have, despite what the system teaches us, but the quality of your relationships with other people. So maybe the number one thing is our interdependence, that we're part of each other, and somehow the delusion that it's a free-for-all to see who can get the most. Maybe we can see through that.
Yeah.
Thank you for your questions. And I'm sorry I went on so long, but those are really tough questions.
No, please don't apologize. And thank you. I'll just throw in very quickly that I think a couple of concepts that Buddhism can really contribute are the concepts of interdependence and collective liberation. I think those are concepts whose time has very much come. So in the stack, I have Dorothea, Yuri, Jenny, and then Philip. So Dorothea, you're next.
Hi, thank you so much, David, for being here. My question is about Sangha. You talked about we need to really deepen and strengthen our Sangha. I'm thinking of the Buddhists acting with Extinction Rebellion. There's a connection there. How do we replicate that kind of collaborative spirit between engaged Buddhists and quote unquote non-Buddhists in all other aspects of, social activism or justice, social justice work? How do you think we could integrate ourselves in non-Buddhist quote unquote movements? And there's a lot that are happening very strong around the world and in the US.
Right.
Thank you. And also, I just want to add, I hope Marx is also right that capitalism is digging its own grave. Thank you.
Frankly, I think it is, but it might be all of ours grave. That's the concern. Yeah, thank you for a really important question there again. And it's an opportunity to touch on something that I only alluded to very, very briefly at the beginning of my talk, which is social justice issues. I mean, I think it's really unfortunate how easy we fall into a kind of duality that, we're talking about saving the earth and species and all that, and we're not talking about issues of racism or other social justice issues. And I think it's so important to realize they are different aspects of the same fundamental problem, which is to say dualities, right? Uh, I'm different from you. We're different from them. Our species is different from other species. We're not only different, we're better, or at least we can pursue our own interest in different or at your expense. And this just applies to so much. So many of the social issues, it seems, come down to that fundamental sense of separation. And whereas classical Buddhism has emphasized so much of that on the individual level, I think the challenge today is seeing so much how that's playing out on the level of white privilege, right? And white supremacy and U.S. nationalism, and our country exploiting the resources of people in Central America and then erecting a wall so they can't get in when we've helped destroy their lives. I mean, there are so many examples of that. So from a Buddhist perspective, it just seems to me that they are very much aspects of the same fundamental problem of duality and the sense of separation, and that they all require us to realize our interdependence, but also to act in ways. I mean, sorry, I realize I'm only indirectly responding to your question. I'm not sure what I can say except that I don't really see the issue as Buddhists forming our own movements. I think there's lots of good stuff going on, and it's important for us to discriminate, some of the best of those movements, and to play a role within them as best we can.
I,
There's,
yeah, I
there's,
think that was my question, was how do we as Buddhists engage in those movements, not so much us building our own movements,
yeah,
because yeah,
got it.
but thank you. You
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether we need to do it as Buddhists. I mean, it's an interesting thing about Buddhism. If you're a Buddhist, it's not important that you identify yourself as a Buddhist, right? I mean, there are times when that seems an appropriate thing to do. It might be very helpful. And there are lots of times when calling myself a Buddhist doesn't add anything at all and might even create might even create problems, right? So I think it's really important to be flexible there in terms of or skillful means in terms of how we relate to the groups and the specific situations. So I don't think we have to come in as Buddhists, although when it's appropriate, when people are open to it and they're interested in that, then we can share our perspective. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say, Dorothea. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I don't see Yuri's hand up right now, but I had Yuri next in the stack. So Yuri, are you still here?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry.
Next.
Good night, David. Good night, everyone. Thank you for your talk, David. I'm sorry for my English. I'm not a native speaker.
You sound good to me.
Okay, that's good. Great. You kind of answered part of my question when you answered the last question Carson had, but I got stuck on something when you talked about the after Shakyamuni Buddha died, like the founders, the leaders had to cope with the monarchies. The monarchies today, the corporations, they kind of push somehow the individualism on all over the world, and maybe Buddhism thrives all over the world right now because it kind of flowed with it, kind of like working with the individual illumination, kind of. I don't know how to explain it, but how to and at the same time we really need to build collective solution, like you said. So how to not kill Buddhism, like leaving the individual on the side, and also attack the real problem, with possible solutions, kind of. I don't know if it's clear, but
Well, I think your way of expressing it really expresses the fundamental problem very clearly. Thank you. It's like I like the comparison, with royalty and corporations and how they all encourage a kind of individualism, a sort of disempowering individualism, right? Not only classical Buddhism, but you think about corporate consumer capitalism. It encourages us to be individuals, and how also um, how corporations, for example, they've spent a lot of time on advertising and social media, wanting to persuade us that the ecological crisis is really about my carbon footprint, and that the solution is an individual one where I need to reduce my carbon footprint as much as possible, and so do each of us. And if we all do it, then everything will be okay, which is rubbish. I mean, they want us to think that, but again, it's the individualistic trap. And it's also the trap that I think, I don't know if trap, but one reason I think why Buddhism has caught on as well as it has in the US and in the West and generally is that it fits into that kind of individualism of the modern world. I mean, especially in the US, the most individualistic country probably ever in human history, is just one more example. And in fact, we can consume Buddhism in the same way that we consume other things, right? I'm not only going to have a really nice electric car and solar panels, but I'm going to get enlightenment, right? It'll be my enlightenment, and that sort of thing just carries on. And so, without really being able to answer your question very well, I think you're pointing to the fundamental problem of the whole point of Sangha is going to be to help us overcome those individualistic delusions which are operating on so many different levels, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Jenny, you're next.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us. I enjoyed hearing you the other week, actually. So thank you for reminding us about not knowing mind. And because in the midst of all the turmoil this year and the grief, I find that the rate of social change this year is really in hyper mode. And that gave me some hope. There's been a lot of awakening in some ways, and massive amounts of delusion in this country this year, especially with the social movement, with George Floyd. So that gives me hope. So with that in mind, can you speak to awakening and awareness? Because a lot of Buddhists practice in various ways, trying to see things more clearly and awakening and understanding things more fully so that they can act in more skillful ways, right? And so ecologically, that means, perhaps consuming in different patterns, more conscious consumption, maybe less animal products or more sustainable products, or knowing where your products come from. Is it created by slave labor? Things like that. Many of these movements are going on. And a small story is that I remember sitting in an Extinction Rebellion meeting in a circle, and they were talking about what signage they were going to use. And I kept insisting, I was like, well, maybe you need to put climate justice, the word justice, on those signs. This is, there's a lot of conversations going on about extraction of cheap labor from people of color, and extraction of resources and animal products, and it's put us in this boat where justice and then just simple activism on climate are not separate. You have to work on racism and climate change solutions at the same time, because they're interlinked.
exactly. Yeah.
So I kind of explained my reasoning why I was pushing for the word justice in that signage. And the woman who asked the question just sort of sat there with very wide-eyed. And I could tell that she was really having some very expansive thoughts at that time. And I'm hoping and praying that we can have a lot of discussions with our communities, not just the Buddhist community, that really kicks in this awakening and awareness in a very speedy way, like the Black Lives Matter movement. We don't know what's going to happen. Change can be accelerated. So I have hope for that. Can you speak about that Buddhist practice of awakening and awareness?
Well, insofar as it enters into your 2 points, let me just take them in order, because this issue of having hope because of the pandemic and that there's been such radical change so quickly, I think it's worth pointing out that pandemics and similar catastrophes have often been turning points in history, that they have enabled. It's like it's shaken up the old order enough that it's enabled something new to come forth. At the beginning, I referred to the 14th century Europe, where the plague, killed like a third of the people. A lot of historians say that that actually was the beginning of the end for the old medieval order, that opened up and actually helped to create the Renaissance. That at that time, Europe was in a kind of Malthusian trap. There were too many people, very hard to feed, and suddenly labor became rare, and anyway, huge changes came out of that. And I can't help wondering, as you are, whether the kind of total crisis that we've all been in this last year, although obviously a lot more horrible for some than others, whether that is shaking, and even things like what Joe Biden is doing with some of his sort of progressive. I see that as maybe a little sign of that. Yeah. Regarding your example of XR, you really, I think, hit a really important nail there. And as you probably know, in America, there's been a split in XR over exactly that matter, that some of the people wanted to incorporate these social justice, right? This ecological justice, climate justice concerns, and others were resisting it. And I think it's the classic example. Do we see them as separate, or do we see them as manifestations of the same fundamental dukkha based on the same delusion of separation? And I guess the wonderful thing that I see beginning to happen is that we're all starting to see these as different manifestations of the same fundamental delusion, which is what Buddhism really has to offer. And I think, I don't know what more I can say, except that I think what you're emphasizing is exactly the direction that we need to move in, that the kind of enlightenment or awakening that we're talking about, we can no longer think that somehow that awakening is going to exclude understanding of my own white privilege, white supremacy generally, and so it's not just how I as a human being relate to the earth, it's how I as a white male relate to other people of color and women. It's so I think it's just wonderful that the awakening is happening in many dimensions, and we're seeing that they're all interconnected.
Sure. And I would include how we're relating to other species on the planet, because that is also a big cause of climate catastrophe as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I appreciate the reference to species, because it's easy to fall into a kind of speciesism, because trees don't complain, they don't demonstrate, they don't vote. And somehow we can get caught up in our language, and we're still caught up in the circle of human beings and missing the fact that we're just one species, and what's at stake here applies to millions of species. Yeah. Thank you, Jenny.
Okay. And lastly, we have Philip. So
Good to see Philip.
David, great to see you too. And thanks so much, as always, just so rich to be with you and to examine these, critically important issues. They're, foundational, obviously. And I'm grateful to have kind of followed on the dialogue with Jenny. But I want to come back to, you said so much, but at the beginning you talked about kind of what I took as being the two sides of the coin, examining our exploitation of the environment and the beings, the sentient beings within it. And I think that's a crucially important or totality, I guess I would say, that, you talked about dualism and that being the fundamental, error, to be, we're separate, and just want to bring that into the conversation, especially around the impact of the exploitation of animals and where and sentient beings. And where an eco-sattva, I would just introduce for consideration that, recognizing all sentient beings as being members of the moral community, which is explicit in Buddhism, would be foundational to the eco-sattva path. And I just wanted to share, or comment briefly, two things you said that were really stood out for me about, yes, greenhouse gases, being aware of the impact of greenhouse gases, but it's so much more than that. Deforestation, species extinction, ocean acidification, to be conscious of that. And in total, the single biggest impact on all of environmental degradation is so-called animal agriculture. And to be really conscious of that, there was a study that just came out this week that I think is going to prove to be, groundbreaking, if not revolutionary, by the founder of Climate Healers, Dr. Sailesh Rao, published in a peer-reviewed journal saying that 87% of greenhouse gases are derived from animal agriculture.
Wow.
So we're talking, really major. And I think that justice element, so the environment on which all life, depends, and then justice, for all sentient beings, as being two sides of the coin. And, I just see the Overton window being shifted from Jenny's comments, from our conversations to continue, which I value so much, and just to raise awareness that of an eco-sattva path, it just seems to me to be foundational to really champion justice being extended to all sentient beings, for those beings and for the environment on which all life depends. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for, the Sangha here. That I'm so grateful for the conversation about Sangha, because I've just come to so appreciate it in the COVID, lockdown situation, how crucially important it is to be in community. So thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Philip, for all of that. And thank you for, adding to what I didn't and should have earlier on. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just so built into the Buddhist path. And there are so many reasons to be vegan. I mean, they're just pile on top of each other in terms of not just compassion to other sentient beings, but like you say, carbon emissions, what's better for our bodies, et cetera, and even if one is for whatever reason not able to go all the way, the basic idea of reducing as much as we can is just, I think, an essential part of the path. Yeah. I agree completely.
Thank you. And just briefly, because there's a misconception, so vegan intrinsic to the definition is avoiding exploiting animals as far as possible and practicable. So some people, because of systemic, impacts, could not maybe go all the way, but to do what we can. Absolutely. Thank you.
So, and that applies to everything.
Absolutely.
Rather than being perfectionist, where the perfect is the enemy of the good. Yeah. So thank you all.
Right. Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming tonight and for all of the good questions. We posted a couple times in the chat. Please consider offering some dana to David for his time in teaching tonight. That link is in the chat. And you can go to BuddhistAction.org to find out more about Buddhist Action Coalition and get on our mailing list, or if you're interested in organizing with us or setting up a Buddhist Action Coalition in your area, there's an email address there as well. I think it's BuddhistActionNY.org. I'm not even sure exactly what it is, but it's in there. And it's on our, you can contact us on our website as well. Okay. Yes, thank you very much. And have a great night, everyone.
Can I just say one more thing very
please.
quickly? Yeah. Instead of donating to me, you might want to donate to the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center, and that's tax deductible. So.
Okay, yeah, great. We don't have that link available, but I'm sure if you Google Rocky Mountain, what is it? Rocky Mountain Dharma.
Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center, rmerc.com. Sure. Anyway, just do a search for it, Eco-Dharma. It'll pull it up, and if you can't find it, let me know. And there's a donation button right on the site, and that'll be tax deductible, which for some people makes a difference. Yeah.